My daughter got married. She still doesn't know I inherited $7 million from my wife. Thank God, because if she did, this day would not look the same. I sat there in the front row of the church, dressed in my best suit, trying to steady the emotions swirling inside me as the music filled the hall. Everyone around me was smiling, whispering, and dabbing tears of joy as they watched my only daughter, Sarah, walk down the aisle in her white gown. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. She was radiant, glowing with happiness, her arm looped with her soon-to-be husband's, and for a moment I let myself enjoy the pride of a father watching his little girl step into the next chapter of her life. But beneath that smile, beneath the polite claps and nods to relatives and old friends, I carried a secret that none of them knew, a secret that weighed heavy, yet also gave me a strange sense of power. They saw a retired old man in his late 60s, someone whose life's work was over, whose role was just to give away his daughter to another man. What they did not see was the truth. After my wife's passing, I had quietly inherited $7 million, money that Sarah, her husband, and even some greedy relatives thought never existed. I had kept it hidden, locked away in accounts and trusts under my name, shielded from prying eyes, because experience had taught me that money has a way of corrupting even the closest bonds. Today, as I sat in that pew, listening to vows about loyalty and forever love, I wondered how many of the people smiling at me now would still treat me the same if they knew what I truly held. I looked at Sarah as she exchanged rings, her laughter ringing out pure and full of life, and for a fleeting moment I thought about my late wife. How proud she would have been to see her daughter like this, how she would have cried more tears than the rest of the church combined. But I also remembered her words in the hospital bed, words that still haunted me. Be careful with the money, James. Don't let it ruin her. That was why I never told Sarah. She was young, reckless with credit cards, quick to fall for trends and friends who were only there when she was buying. She thought I had just enough to survive retirement, maybe a small pension, nothing more. And that was how I intended to keep it, at least for now. The ceremony moved forward, the couple kissed, and the church erupted in applause. I clapped along, smiling, but my mind was elsewhere. They had no idea that the man applauding in the front row was not just a retired father, but a guardian of a fortune. I wondered what would happen when the truth eventually came out. For now, I stayed silent, letting the secret sit inside me as both a shield and a weapon, one that I suspected I might need sooner than I thought. From the moment Sarah was old enough to roll her eyes at me, I knew she would grow into a woman who demanded more from the world than she was willing to give. At the wedding reception, the shine of the ceremony was still fresh, but I caught glimpses of the real Sarah slipping through the cracks of her carefully staged smile. While she basked in the attention of her new in-laws and friends, she barely acknowledged me. I stood quietly at the corner of the ballroom, sipping a glass of water, while others toasted with champagne, and every time our eyes met, she looked away as if embarrassed by me, as if the sight of her aging father was somehow an inconvenience to her perfect night. I had spent decades working long shifts, holidays sacrificed, and sleepless nights endured just to make sure she had everything she ever needed, from piano lessons to expensive clothes, from tuition fees at a private school to the down payment on her first car. Yet, when her friends or colleagues asked her how she managed all those luxuries, she never once mentioned me. She spoke as though she had simply deserved them by existing. Now, watching her glide across the floor in a designer gown I knew she had begged her fiancé to splurge on, I felt the familiar sting of being treated as nothing more than a background figure in her story. She laughed louder with strangers than she ever did with me, her voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that had colored her tone since her teenage years. I overheard her dismissively say to one of her bridesmaids, "Dad doesn't get it. He's too old-fashioned, too stuck in his ways. He doesn't understand how things work now." The words weren't meant for my ears, but they pierced through me all the same. She saw me not as the man who carried her on my shoulders, who stayed up late fixing her projects when she was too tired, who worked double just to keep her from going without no. She saw me as an outdated relic of a different era, someone whose opinions belonged in the past. And yet, she never hesitated to ask for money, never failed to expect support when she overspent on shopping sprees or when her credit cards reached their limits. I gave, not because I wanted to spoil her, but because I believed she would one day grow to understand gratitude. That day never came. Standing in that lavish ballroom, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and laughter, I realized she still didn't know the truth. She still didn't know that behind the weary eyes of her old man lay a secret worth $7 million. If she ever discovered it, I feared her greed would overshadow any remaining love she had for me. Watching her toss her hair and order others around with that entitled smirk, I wondered if keeping the inheritance from her wasn't just a choice, but a necessary act of protection. As the wedding guests danced and the music swelled, my mind wandered back to her, my late wife, Margaret. The world saw her as gentle, graceful, and endlessly patient, but to me, she was also shrewd in ways most people never realized. She had always carried a quiet wisdom about people, a way of reading their hearts beyond their words, and she had long ago discerned what I was too stubborn to admit about our daughter. Margaret loved Sarah with every fiber of her being, but she saw the cracks in her character early on. She noticed how Sarah's demands grew sharper with age, how gratitude faded while entitlement flourished, how kindness only appeared when something was to be gained. I used to tell Margaret that Sarah would grow out of it, that once she faced real life, she would learn humility. But Margaret would simply sigh, place her soft hand on mine, and whisper, "Some lessons are never learned, no matter how much life teaches." When Margaret was diagnosed, we faced her illness together, walking through those dark months with dignity, though every day I prayed for a miracle that never came. In the final weeks, when the house was filled with silence and she no longer had the strength to leave the bed, she called me close. Her eyes, though tired, still carried that same fire, that same clarity. "I don't trust Sarah with everything we've built," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't value it. She doesn't value you." At first, her words cut me because I didn't want to believe them. A father's love clings to hope, even when hope is thin. But Margaret wasn't speaking from bitterness. She was speaking from understanding. She had prepared carefully, more carefully than I ever realized. She had arranged her affairs so that when the inevitable came, the full inheritance, $7 million, accumulated from decades of investments, savings, and her own family's estate, would come directly to me and to me alone. No joint accounts, no easy access for Sarah, no loopholes that could be exploited by greed. "Promise me," Margaret said, gripping my hand with the last of her strength, "that you won't let her waste it. Use it for good. Use it for those who deserve it." I promised her, and as the tears fell from my eyes, I knew she was right. After she passed, the documents confirmed everything: the accounts, the trusts, the properties, all under my name alone. It was her final act of love, a shield to protect not only me, but also the legacy of everything we had worked for. Even now, as I sat among the guests at Sarah's wedding, her laughter echoing from across the room, I could hear Margaret's voice in my heart. She had known this day would come, the day when Sarah's true nature would be on full display. The inheritance was more than money. It was a safeguard against the greed that my late wife foresaw, and a reminder that her wisdom still guided me even from beyond the grave. The applause of the wedding crowd faded into the background as I sat alone at my table watching my daughter in her gown, smiling for the cameras. For everyone else, this was a day filled with joy and beginnings, but for me, it only deepened the echo of loss that had lived in my chest for years. Margaret should have been here, seated by my side, her hand resting gently on mine, her smile glowing as she watched Sarah walk down the aisle. Instead, there was only the empty chair in my heart, the silence that had been my companion ever since cancer took her from me. People often talk about grief as a storm, wild and furious, but for me, it had been more like a slow erosion. The house grew quieter, meals grew smaller, days grew longer. I would wake in the middle of the night reaching out for a hand that was no longer there. The bed was vast and cold without her warmth. Some nights, I would sit in Margaret's old chair, clutching one of her scarves just to breathe in the faint trace of her perfume, a scent that faded more each year until finally it was gone. What surprised me most in those lonely years was not just the absence of my wife, but the absence of my daughter. Sarah, who once as a child clung to her mother's skirts, had grown into a woman who saw visits not as family time, but as opportunities. When she called, it was almost always to ask for something: money for tuition, money for rent, money for some new venture she insisted was too good to fail. I gave, of course. Fathers give even when it hurts. But the thanks were brief, mechanical, and often absent altogether. She never stayed long when she visited, never lingered to share a meal or listen to my stories. The house that once rang with laughter had become nothing more than a stopover for her convenience. On birthdays or holidays, she would sometimes forget to call. When she remembered, it was with the tone of someone checking off a task rather than cherishing a moment. Each year, the distance between us grew wider, and I found myself wondering if I had already lost her long before Margaret passed. I filled the silence with old records, books Margaret loved, and long walks through the park where I envied couples still holding hands in their twilight years. Sometimes neighbors would invite me over, sensing the solitude, but I always declined. Their kindness only reminded me of what I had lost. Tonight, sitting amid the clinking glasses and music, I realized just how invisible I had become in Sarah's world. She was radiant in her gown, surrounded by friends and her new husband, while I was little more than a shadow in the corner, tolerated rather than cherished. My heart ached, not only from loneliness, but from the cruel truth that my daughter only ever came close when she wanted something. That was the coldest part of it all, not the silence of my empty house, but the silence in her heart where love for me should have lived. Weddings are supposed to bring families together, but as I stood there at the reception hall, I felt more like a guest than a father. The chandeliers sparkled above us, the champagne flowed freely, and laughter rolled through the air like a tide, yet none of it reached me. My daughter, Sarah, floated across the room in her white dress, her arm linked with her new husband's. She looked radiant, I'll admit, but not once did her eyes soften when they fell on me. Instead, her smile thinned, as though acknowledging me was an obligation she could not avoid. "Dad, this is my father," she said flatly to a group of her friends, almost as if she were introducing an old colleague or an unwelcome stranger. Her voice carried none of the warmth one might expect on such a momentous day. She gestured toward me as if I were some afterthought, an accessory to the celebration rather than one of the reasons it even existed. I extended my hand politely, offering a smile, but I could see the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes. She didn't linger. She moved on quickly, pulling her husband along, eager to escape the moment. What stung most wasn't her tone or her haste, but the subtle disdain hidden behind her smile. Sarah had always been conscious of appearances, but tonight it was sharpened to a blade. I overheard her telling one of her bridesmaids, "Dad's simple. He's always lived a modest life. Don't mind him." The words slipped out casually, but they cut deeper than any insult could. Modest. Simple. As if the years I spent working double shifts, fixing broken things, paying for her schooling, and keeping food on the table were something to be ashamed of. She said it with the same dismissiveness one might use for an outdated piece of furniture. When another guest asked about her parents, Sarah smiled tightly and answered, "My mom passed away years ago. Dad's still around, as though my very existence was little more than a footnote, a lingering shadow that hadn't quite disappeared yet." I stood by the buffet table, plate in hand, pretending to study the dishes, though I wasn't hungry. My appetite had drained away with each cold introduction, each sidelong glance she gave me, as if I didn't quite belong in her glittering world. Her new in-laws barely spoke to me, likely guided by the way Sarah herself treated me, distant, dismissive, detached, but I said nothing. I smiled when she glanced my way, applauded during the speeches, and raised my glass when the toasts were made. All the while, a hollow ache spread through my chest. A father should be proud at his daughter's wedding, basking in the joy of her new beginning. Instead, I felt reduced to a prop, paraded around the room without dignity or regard. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man they treated as invisible carried a secret larger than any of the chandeliers above. $7 million sat quietly in my hands, a legacy left by her mother, a legacy she would never control. If Sarah's coldness toward me stung, the behavior of her new in-laws only deepened the wound. The groom's family carried themselves with the kind of pride that money alone seemed to buy. Their suits were perfectly tailored, their jewelry understated yet unmistakably expensive, and their conversations centered on vacations abroad, investments, and business ventures I could only vaguely follow. They moved as though the entire reception belonged to them, as though everyone else was simply there to marvel at their stature. I watched as Sarah leaned eagerly toward them, laughing at their jokes, her voice rising in pitch with every attempt to charm them. She was radiant, yes, but it was the kind of radiance that comes from striving to belong rather than simply being at ease. I noticed the way she glanced at me occasionally, her eyes flicking over my worn suit, the one I'd kept pressed for years, saving it for important occasions like this. Her smile would falter slightly whenever her gaze lingered too long. It was as though my very presence threatened the image she was so desperate to project. The groom's mother, a regal woman draped in silk, looked me up and down the first time we were introduced. She smiled politely, but her eyes betrayed a judgment she didn't bother to hide. "So you're Sarah's father," she said, her tone a mixture of surprise and condescension, as though she had expected someone else, someone who looked more like her own kind. I extended my hand, and though she shook it, the grip was light, almost perfunctory. She turned back to her circle almost immediately, her laughter returning with ease once I was out of sight. The groom's father was no different. He spoke loudly about business deals and upcoming mergers, his gold watch flashing with every gesture. When Sarah introduced me, he nodded curtly, his attention already sliding elsewhere. "Ah, yes, the father," he said, as though checking a box. He didn't ask about my work, my life, or even about the years I had spent raising Sarah after her mother passed. To him, I was invisible, a placeholder with no relevance in his world of wealth and power. Sarah noticed, of course. She stood straighter whenever she was near them, her words polished and precise. She laughed louder than usual, spoke of ambitions she never once mentioned to me, and painted herself as someone far above the daughter I had known. But the most painful moment came when she corrected me, right there in front of them. I had made a small comment about her childhood, a fond memory of the time we went camping by the lake. "Oh, Dad," she interrupted with a dismissive laugh. "That was ages ago. Things are different now." She brushed it off as if the memory were an embarrassment, something better left unspoken in front of people who might see it as common. I remained silent, but inside, something twisted. My daughter wasn't just marrying into this family, she was erasing me to do it. To her, my modest life, my sacrifices, my very existence were blemishes she wanted to hide. What she didn't know, what none of them could even imagine, was that the man she was ashamed of was the one holding the key to a fortune greater than anything this wealthy family believed they controlled. The reception hall sparkled with chandeliers and polished silverware, a spectacle designed to impress the groom's family and their well-heeled friends. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air, the kind of polished atmosphere that seemed to fit everyone except me. I sat at my assigned table, tucked slightly to the side, watching as servers in crisp uniforms glided between the guests. Then came the speeches. One by one, family members and friends stepped up to the microphone to toast the newlyweds. There were heartfelt stories, jokes about the groom's youthful adventures, and sentimental recollections of college romances. The crowd laughed and clapped, the rhythm of celebration rolling along smoothly. Then it was Sarah's turn. She took the microphone, glowing in her white dress, her eyes scanning the crowd with the confidence of someone who felt she had finally arrived at the life she wanted. Her voice was sweet and charming, her words rehearsed just enough to sound natural. She thanked the groom's family for their generosity, her friends for their support, and then, inevitably, she turned her gaze toward me. "And of course," she said with a coy smile, "I have to thank my father. He's always been, well, let's just say frugal. Some people might call it cheap, but I like to think of it as his quirky way of keeping life interesting." The guests laughed, a ripple of amusement spreading through the room. She wasn't finished. Growing up, I remember asking for the latest toys or gadgets, and Dad would say, "No, sweetheart, we don't need that." He thought camping trips and reading books were better than shopping malls or fancy vacations. She rolled her eyes playfully, the crowd chuckling along. It was quaint, a little boring sometimes, but I suppose it taught me patience. Her friends laughed loudly at the word boring, and even the groom's family smirked, casting glances in my direction as though they finally understood why Sarah was so eager to climb into their world. I smiled politely, nodding, though each word pricked like a thorn. It wasn't just a joke, it was a dismissal of everything I had ever given, every sacrifice I had made. To her, my thrift was a flaw, my simplicity a mark of shame. She didn't see the hours I worked, the meals I skipped, the countless nights of exhaustion I endured to keep her clothed, educated, and safe. She saw only the absence of luxury. The crowd applauded as she handed the microphone back, her laughter ringing like triumph. I clapped along, my smile never wavering, though inside I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than ever. In that moment, I realized something with chilling clarity. My daughter had not only rejected my way of life, she had weaponized it, turning my sacrifices into punchlines for the amusement of strangers. And yet, none of them knew what I carried within me, a secret that could turn the laughter into silence, the smirks into shock. I raised my glass, sipped quietly, and told myself to endure. My time would come. The evening wound down, the music softening as guests drifted toward the dance floor or lounged near the bar. My daughter's laughter carried above the din, her voice smooth and practiced, fitting so naturally into the groom's world of polished charm and excess. I was gathering my coat when I felt a tug at my sleeve. "Dad," Sarah said, her smile slipping into something tighter, more calculated. "Can we talk?" She led me away from the crowd, toward a quiet corner near the back hall. The noise of the reception softened behind us, replaced by the steady hum of an air vent and the faint clatter of dishes being cleared. Her eyes flicked around, making sure no one was watching, before she crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. "Look," she began, her voice dropping its sweetness. "I'll get straight to the point. Mark and I are starting a new life together, and things are going to be expensive. We want to buy a bigger house soon, keep up with his family, you know. Appearances matter." I waited, letting her continue. "And, well, I know you don't have much," she said with a shrug, as though she were doing me a kindness by acknowledging it. "You've never really been able to give me what I needed growing up. But I was hoping you could at least help with some of the smaller things, a down payment maybe, or covering some of the wedding expenses we still owe. It's not like we're asking for millions." Her words struck like small, deliberate cuts. She spoke with the assumption that I was a man drained of worth, an old relic who had scraped by his whole life and had nothing left to offer. There was no gratitude in her tone, no recognition of the sacrifices that had built the foundation she now stood on. Instead, there was entitlement, her request framed more as an expectation than a plea. I studied her face, the impatience in her eyes, the slight tap of her manicured nails against her arm. She wasn't asking because she believed I had resources. She was asking because she assumed I didn't and therefore thought she could squeeze what little I might still have without consequence. "Sarah," I said softly, careful to mask the weight in my voice, "I've always tried to give you what I could, but sometimes what we want and what we need aren't the same thing." She rolled her eyes, a familiar gesture from her teenage years that now carried even sharper disdain. "Dad, please, don't give me another one of your lectures about needs. I'm married now. I can't show up at Mark's family gatherings and look like I came from nothing. Do you understand? This is about my future." I nodded slowly, keeping my smile faint and steady. Inside, though, I felt the cold burn of truth. My daughter didn't see me as a father anymore. To her, I was a bank account she assumed was empty, a shadow of usefulness. She thought she knew everything. She had no idea. The hum of the reception hall filled the silence between us, a soft backdrop of laughter and clinking glasses. My daughter's eyes bored into me, expectant, as if waiting for me to crack under the weight of her demand. She stood there with her arms crossed, chin tilted high, the same posture she had taken since she was a teenager whenever she wanted to bend me to her will. For a moment, I let the silence linger. I could have ended everything right then. I could have told her about the $7 million my late wife entrusted to me, could have watched her face shift from disdain to greed in the blink of an eye. But that would have given her too much power, power she had never learned to respect. So instead, I drew in a slow breath and gave her the calmest smile I could manage. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady and unhurried. I'm proud you're starting your own family now, but I have to be honest with you, I can't take care of your lifestyle. I have my own needs to think about these days. Her eyes widened, not with shock but with indignation, as though my refusal were some form of betrayal. She laughed, sharp and bitter, shaking her head. Your own needs? Really, Dad? You've lived small your whole life. What needs could you possibly have? You don't travel. You don't go out. You don't do anything. You sit in that little house and, what? Watch old movies? You don't need money. You never did. Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. I had weathered storms far harsher than her careless cruelty. This was just another wave crashing against a rock that refused to move. I understand how it looks, I replied gently, but I'm not as empty as you think. I've given most of my life to making sure you were taken care of. Now I have to take care of myself. I hope you can understand that. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes, anger, disbelief, maybe even fear that I truly had nothing to give her. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a sneer. Unbelievable, she muttered. Even on my wedding day, you managed to disappoint me. With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her silk dress brushing the floor in sharp, hurried steps. She didn't look back. Not once. I stood alone in the corner, the faint echoes of her heels swallowed by the music and laughter of the party. I felt the familiar ache of loss, not for the money, not for the pride, but for the daughter I once thought I had. Somewhere along the way, she had chosen the world's approval over her father's love. And yet, as I straightened my shoulders and adjusted my coat, a quiet strength settled over me. I didn't need her approval, nor did I need to reveal my secret. My late wife had trusted me for a reason, and I intended to honor that trust even if it meant standing alone. Long after Sarah stormed off into the sea of guests, I found myself retreating to a quiet corner of the reception hall, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses muffled by distance. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, and for a moment I wasn't watching my daughter's wedding anymore. My mind drifted backward, to the night my wife first told me of the will, the hidden will she had crafted with such foresight and care. It was late, I remember. She was already frail, her illness slowly draining the warmth from her body. Yet her mind was sharp as ever, her eyes glowing with the kind of wisdom that always seemed to pierce straight through me. We were sitting in the living room, the fire casting long shadows across the walls, and she reached for my hand with a grip that still had strength in it. "Henry," she had whispered, her voice weak but steady, "you know our daughter. You've seen it, the way she looks at money, the way she treats people when she thinks she's above them. I love her. I always will, but I don't trust her with the life we've built together." I wanted to argue then, to defend Sarah, to tell her she was just young and misguided, but my wife shook her head, silencing me before the words left my lips. She always had that ability, to know what I was about to say and to answer before I could speak. "No," she continued, "this isn't just a phase. This is who she has chosen to become, and if we hand her everything we've worked for, she'll waste it. She'll destroy herself with it. I won't allow that." That night, she told me about the arrangements she had already made. $7 million, carefully invested, protected by legal safeguards, and a trust she had created in my name. Only I had access to it. Only I could decide where it went and when. And she made me swear on the life we had shared that I would never reveal it to Sarah until she proved herself worthy of it. At first I had resisted. It felt cruel to withhold such a gift from our only child. But my wife, with her calm and unshakable wisdom, leaned closer and placed a trembling hand on my cheek. "One day," she said, "you'll see why this is necessary. One day she'll stand before you and demand what she believes is hers. And when that day comes, I need you to be strong enough to say no. Because this isn't about punishing her, it's about protecting her from herself." Now, sitting in that crowded reception hall, I realized that day had come. My wife had seen it all before I ever could. She had known the greed, the entitlement, the hunger for status that would eventually consume our daughter. And she had given me the tools to stand firm. I closed my eyes, hearing her voice again in the quiet corners of my memory. "Be strong, Henry. Protect her, even if she hates you for it." When I opened them again, I wasn't bitter. I wasn't broken. I was resolved. My wife had left me more than money. She had left me the strength to do what was right. It didn't take long after the wedding for cracks to appear in Sarah's new world. At first, she and her husband Daniel lived like royalty. Social media overflowed with their smiling photos, dinner at exclusive restaurants, vacations at coastal resorts, expensive designer clothes, and gifts exchanged with extravagant flair. Their posts painted the picture of a glamorous couple climbing the ladder of wealth and influence. But I knew what sat behind those polished smiles, the bill collectors, the debts, the constant chase for appearances. Months passed, and the visits to my home grew fewer. Sarah, once my little girl who used to curl up in my lap with storybooks, had become a woman I barely recognized. She didn't call to ask how I was doing. She didn't stop by to share coffee or stories about her new life. The only time I heard her voice was when she needed something. The first call came late one evening. "Dad, Daniel's car broke down," she said briskly, skipping any pleasantries. "We had to get it towed, and the repairs are going to be outrageous. Could you help us out? Just a few thousand, nothing major." I felt that familiar tug in my chest, the urge to rescue her, to shield her from hardship. But my wife's voice echoed in my mind, steady and clear. "Protect her from herself." I hesitated, then told Sarah I couldn't cover the entire amount, but I could lend a smaller sum. She sighed heavily, thanked me half-heartedly, and hung up. It was the first of many such calls. One month it was credit card bills piling up. Another time it was a mortgage payment they had accidentally overlooked. Daniel's supposed business ventures drained money faster than they could earn it. They leased a luxury apartment they couldn't afford, threw parties for friends who only came for the free drinks, and bought clothes as if they were celebrities. And yet, every time Sarah called, her tone was the same expectant, impatient, as though my support was not a favor, but her right. "Dad," she once said, her voice sharp, "you can't expect me to live like you. Daniel and I have a reputation to maintain. We can't just—" She paused, searching for the word, settle for ordinary. Ordinary. That was what I had become in her eyes. A man who had worked an honest job, paid his bills, and lived within his means. A man who had worn humility as a badge of honor. To Sarah, that was failure. Still, I never revealed the inheritance. The $7 million sat untouched in accounts only I could access, a fortress built by my wife's wisdom. I could have cleared every one of Sarah's debts with a single check, yet I chose silence. Every request she made, every assumption she carried, only confirmed what my wife had feared. Sarah wasn't ready, and perhaps she never would be. And so, I watched from the sidelines as the glamorous facade began to crumble. My daughter was sinking deeper into a lifestyle built on appearances, blind to the truth that the only person who could save her was herself. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sarah showed up at my door unannounced. For months, She had only called when she wanted something, her voice sharp and businesslike. But that day, she arrived in person, clutching her handbag as though it were a lifeline. When I opened the door, she gave me a wavering smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "can I come in?" I stepped aside, studying her carefully as she walked past me into the living room. She wore a dress I knew must have cost more than half a month's pension, and her nails were freshly manicured. To anyone else, she might have looked polished and graceful, but I noticed the shadows under her eyes, the faint twitch of desperation she tried to disguise. We sat down, and she wasted no time before launching into her performance. "Things have been difficult," she said, her eyes glistening with what she hoped looked like unshed tears. "Daniel's business had some setbacks. We've had some unexpected expenses. And now, well, we just don't know where else to turn." Her voice cracked on that last line, and she dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue. But I knew my daughter. I had seen real tears from her as a child when she scraped her knee, when her mother scolded her, when she lost her favorite toy. These weren't those tears. This was theater, carefully staged for my benefit. "I understand," I said softly, keeping my face neutral. She leaned forward, seizing on my calmness as though it were an opening. "Dad, if you could just help us this once. Just a little loan, we promise we'll pay you back. It's an emergency." An emergency? The word was sharp in my ears. I looked around the room at her expensive jewelry, the phone in her hand, the designer handbag sitting on the coffee table. Emergencies, in my world, had been hospital bills, late-night calls about car accidents, rushing to cover the mortgage when my paycheck barely stretched far enough. But Sarah's emergencies were of her own making, luxuries dressed up as necessities. I folded my hands, taking a slow breath. "I wish I could help more, Sarah," I said carefully. "But I have to think about my own needs too. Retirement doesn't leave much room for extras." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The tears stopped flowing almost immediately, her mask slipping to reveal irritation. "So you're really just going to sit there while your daughter struggles? After everything you've put me through?" The accusation stung, but I didn't let it show. I simply nodded, letting silence hang between us. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for resistance. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal, all calculation failing her. Finally, she stood up abruptly, muttering under her breath, "I'll figure it out then. Don't worry." I watched her leave, my heart heavy but resolute. She thought her performance had fooled me. She thought I was too blind, too soft to see through her act, but I saw everything. I saw the greed behind her eyes, the entitlement hidden in her words, and for the first time in a long while, I began to realize that perhaps letting her struggle was the only way she might ever learn. It was an old friend, Michael, who first hinted at the truth. He had known my family for decades, back when my late wife was still alive. Michael worked in real estate and often moved in circles where gossip ran freely, especially about those who flaunted wealth they didn't really own. One evening, over coffee, he leaned forward with a grim look on his face. "John," he said, "I think you should know something. I overheard Daniel at a networking event last week. He was bragging about how soon you'll finally loosen up the purse strings. He said your daughter is working on you, trying to get you to open up your wallet." The words landed like a stone in my chest. Michael looked at me carefully, as if measuring whether I could handle the truth. I nodded slowly. "Go on. They think you've got money hidden away," Michael continued. "And from the way they spoke, it wasn't respect I heard. They were mocking you." Daniel said, "You're just an old man clinging to pennies, too stupid to realize you should be giving them the life they deserve." People laughed. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I stayed silent, letting him finish. Sarah laughed too, Michael added softly. Said you were predictable, that you'd always give in eventually, that you were too lonely to say no to her. The knife twisted deeper with every word. I tried to picture my daughter's voice saying those things, my daughter who I had raised, fed, clothed, and carried through storms of her childhood. I remembered late nights staying up with her when she was sick, the sacrifices my wife and I had made so she could go to good schools, have piano lessons, join summer camps, and now all of that was nothing more than ammunition for her mockery. When Michael left that night, I sat alone in the silence of my living room. My wife's picture sat on the mantel, her gentle smile frozen in time. I whispered to her, as I often did, when the loneliness became unbearable. "You were right, love," I murmured. "You always said she had her mother's beauty, but not her heart. You tried to warn me she might let greed consume her. You saw what I didn't want to see." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the envelope, tucked away in my desk drawer, the legal documents that represented my wife's foresight. $7 million, carefully placed into accounts only I could access, untouchable by Sarah or Daniel, a fortress built by a woman who had known our daughter's weaknesses better than I had. I realized then that Sarah's visits, her crocodile tears, her requests for help weren't about family or love. They were moves in a strategy she thought she had perfected. To her and Daniel, I wasn't a father. I was a potential vault. The sting of betrayal was sharp, but alongside it came something unexpected, a grim sense of clarity. The mask was gone. I saw their motives laid bare, and I began to understand that my role now was not to give, but to protect. To protect my wife's legacy, my own dignity, and even perhaps to protect Sarah from the consequences of her own greed. The night I discovered the truth about Sarah and Daniel's intentions, I sat awake long after the clock struck midnight. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that can feel suffocating when you're the only one living in it. My mind kept circling the same words Michael had told me, predictable, too lonely to say no. I looked across the room at my wife's photograph. It was the one I had always favored, taken on a spring afternoon when the garden was in bloom. Her eyes seemed to follow me, steady and kind, yet firm. She had been the wise one between us, and in death, she still seemed to guide me. She had left me the inheritance not simply as a gift, but as a responsibility. She knew our daughter's weaknesses and had acted decisively to protect what we had built. If she could see the present now, I thought, she would not be surprised. She would shake her head and tell me it was time to stop hoping for something that wasn't there, to act with strength instead of sentiment. That night, a decision settled over me like a heavy coat. Not made in anger, though anger had every right to live in me. Not made in bitterness, though betrayal had scorched my heart. No, this decision came from clarity, from duty, from the quiet promise I made at my wife's grave, that I would guard her legacy with everything I had. I realized that confronting Sarah directly would be useless. She would deny, twist, cry, and manipulate until truth itself bent under her voice. Daniel would stand smugly by her side, certain I was the foolish old man they believed me to be. Words wouldn't change them, but actions could. So I resolved to act not as the weak and predictable father they imagined, but as the man my wife had trusted. It was no longer about whether my daughter loved me or not. It was about ensuring that what my wife and I worked for our entire lives went to hands that deserved it, not ones eager to squander it for social status and shallow approval. A strange calmness came with this realization. It was as though I had been holding on to a rope, desperately trying to pull Sarah back from her own greed, and now, finally, I let go. My heart ached, yes, but it also steadied. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't some pathetic man clinging to pennies. I was the sole guardian of a legacy, and I had choices she would never see coming. I stood, walked to my desk, and opened the drawer where the legal documents rested. My fingers brushed the papers, but instead of checking balances or reviewing contracts, I simply closed the drawer again. I didn't need reassurance. The money was there, safe. The real decision was what to do with it and when. That night, before heading to bed, I whispered once more to the empty house, "I'll protect it, love, just like you wanted, and when the time comes, they'll learn who I truly am." With that, my path was set not toward confrontation, but toward strategy. The days that followed my decision carried a different weight. For the first time in years, I felt as though I was no longer simply drifting through old age, waiting for life to end. I had a purpose again, a responsibility that stretched beyond myself and my broken relationship with Sarah. The inheritance wasn't meant to be a bargaining chip with my daughter or a secret nest egg for me to hoard. It was meant to live on, to grow, to bless others. My wife had always believed in lifting others up, and I realized it was time to honor that belief. So I began planning, quietly, carefully. At first, I spent evenings at my desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, tax codes, and notes scribbled in my handwriting. I consulted an old friend from church who specialized in estate law, a man whose integrity I trusted. Over cups of coffee at his office, I outlined my vision: trusts, scholarships, charitable funds, not just donations, but legacies, structures that would outlive me. I wanted to do it all in her name. Every trust, every scholarship, every charity would bear the name of my late wife. I imagined a young woman walking across a graduation stage, her future brightened by the Margaret Foundation for Women in Music and Arts. I pictured single mothers receiving grants to start small businesses under the Margaret Hope Fund. I saw hospitals expanding wings with plaques that read, "In loving memory of Margaret." Those images filled me with a quiet joy that even the bitter sting of betrayal couldn't erase. There was something beautiful about taking what could have been wasted on shallow parties, designer clothes, and hollow status games, and instead planting it like seeds in fertile soil. Seeds that would grow into opportunities, into changed lives, into futures my wife would have been proud of. As the paperwork came together, I felt myself transforming too. The bitterness I had carried, the loneliness that haunted me, it started to lift, replaced by a sense of dignity. I wasn't just the discarded father, mocked at weddings and pitied by neighbors. I was a man entrusted with a mission, and I made sure to keep it hidden from Sarah. She and Daniel still thought of me as powerless, a relic with little to offer. That was fine. Let them believe it. The quieter I moved, the more secure this legacy became. I wanted the day of revelation, when it came, to strike like a thunderclap, undeniable, irreversible. One evening, after signing documents that finalized the creation of the first trust, I sat back in my chair and exhaled. For the first time in years, I felt my wife's presence in the room, as though she was approving of every step I took. Her voice seemed to echo in my memory: "Do good, even if others do not. Protect what matters, even if it costs you." And so I did. Not for Sarah's approval, not for revenge, not yet, but for Margaret, for the love of my life, whose wisdom outlasted her years. The charities, the scholarships, the trusts, they would carry her name into the future. And when the time came, Sarah would see it all, and she would realize that the fortune she scorned and schemed for was never meant to be hers. The phone calls began first short, clipped, and dripping with tension. "Dad, I need to see you," Sarah would say, her voice flat, rehearsed. But when she finally arrived at my house one late afternoon, there was nothing rehearsed about the desperation etched across her face. She looked different. The polished daughter who once paraded herself as a trophy in high society, circles now appeared frayed at the edges. Her expensive clothes, though still fashionable, no longer carried the same elegance. The shine was gone. Stress had begun to carve lines around her eyes, and her voice carried a frantic tremor she could no longer hide. "Dad, this is ridiculous," she began, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "Daniel and I were drowning. The bills, the mortgage, the wedding expenses, it's too much. You can't just sit here hoarding whatever scraps you have left while your own daughter suffers." I sat quietly in my chair, watching her unravel. She had never come to visit me this often before, only now, when her carefully constructed world was cracking. "You know what I think?" she pressed on, her tone sharp, accusatory. "I think you're hiding something. You couldn't have lived all these years on just your pension. Where's the money? Mom must have left you something. You've been keeping it from me, haven't you?" Her words were knives, but not because of their accusation, because of the truth they carried without her knowing. She was close to uncovering it, yet so blinded by entitlement and anger that she couldn't see the reality in front of her. "Sarah," I said calmly, "I have my own needs. I've managed my life the best way I can. What you're asking of me is more than I can give." She stopped pacing and glared at me, her hands clenched into fists. "More than you can give? You're my father. Your job is to support me. Don't you dare act like you don't have anything left. You're just selfish. You'd rather let me drown than lift a finger to help." I stayed silent, not because I didn't have a response, but because silence sometimes speaks louder than arguments. Her voice cracked as she continued, desperation seeping through her anger. "Do you even realize what people are saying? That Daniel and I can't keep up with the life we deserve? Do you want me humiliated? Do you want us ruined?" In that moment, I saw her clearly, not as the little girl I once carried on my shoulders, but as the woman she had chosen to become. A woman so consumed by appearances that she couldn't recognize genuine love when it stood in front of her. A woman who believed her father's worth was measured only in dollar signs. She finally broke down, collapsing into the sofa with her head in her hands. "If you cared about me, really cared, you'd find a way." I looked at her, feeling a mixture of sorrow and resolve. My wife had been right to shield the inheritance. Sarah wasn't ready for wealth. She would only destroy herself with it. And though she thought she was forcing me into a corner, she didn't realize I was already several steps ahead. The living room felt heavier that evening, as if the air itself had thickened in anticipation of what needed to be said. Sarah sat across from me, her face twisted with impatience and suspicion. She had come not as a daughter seeking comfort, but as a claimant demanding her imagined share of an inheritance she thought was rightfully hers. "Dad," she snapped, folding her arms, "I'm done playing games. People don't just get by like you have unless there's money somewhere. I've heard things, rumors. Did Mom leave you something? Tell me the truth." Her eyes searched mine, hungry, demanding. For months I had endured her barbed words, her veiled accusations, and her shameless begging. I had kept silent out of strategy, out of respect for the woman who entrusted me with everything before she died. But now I could see Sarah would not stop until the truth was dragged into the light. I leaned forward, steadying my voice. "You're right, Sarah. Your mother did leave me something. She left me $7 million. The words landed like a stone tossed into still water. Sarah froze, her jaw slack, her eyes widening with a kind of wild disbelief. $7 million? She whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Yes," I said firmly, $7 million. Every cent of it entrusted to me after your mother passed." For a moment, there was silence. Then came the eruption. "You've been sitting on that kind of money while I've been struggling?" she shrieked. "While Daniel and I have been drowning in debt, trying to keep up with life? You could have helped us. You could have given me everything I needed." Her voice cracked with fury, and she slammed her hands on the table as if force alone could pry the inheritance from me. But I remained steady, my heart pounding with something far stronger than fear. Conviction. "You think this money was meant for you?" I said, my voice rising for the first time. "No, Sarah. Your mother saw who you were becoming. She saw the greed, the arrogance, the way you treated me as nothing but a stepping stone to a lifestyle you think you deserve. That's why she left it in my hands. Because she knew that if it went to you, it would be squandered and lost in months." Her face twisted, the rage mingling with disbelief. "You're lying. Mom would never cut me out like that. You're hoarding it for yourself." I shook my head slowly. "No, Sarah. Your mother loved you, but she wasn't blind. She trusted me to protect the fruits of her life's work, and I've honored that trust. That money will never go to someone who mocks her father behind his back, who only shows up when her bank account runs dry. Not 1 cent of it." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of repentance. They were tears of fury, of entitlement denied. "You can't do this to me," she spat. "I'm your daughter." I stood, my voice steady but final, "and I'm your father. Which is why I won't let you destroy yourself with wealth you haven't earned. The money is safe, Sarah, but it's not yours. It will never be yours." In that instant, I saw it hit her, the realization that her grip on me, on the inheritance, on the life she thought was promised, was gone. The house was quieter than usual, but not the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the heavy silence of defeat, of dreams slipping through fingers like sand. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, her face buried in her hands, tears staining her cheeks as muffled sobs echoed through the dimly lit living room. The confrontation with me had replayed in her head countless times since that night, and each repetition cut deeper. $7 million. The figure haunted her like a ghost, shimmering in front of her eyes, taunting her. It could have been the solution to all her problems, the golden key to the life she thought she deserved. But instead, it was the reminder of her downfall, a fortune that would never be hers. Her husband, Daniel, paced across the room, his phone in hand, pretending to scroll but really just avoiding eye contact. For weeks, he had been distant, but now his detachment had hardened into something undeniable. He no longer looked at her with affection. Instead, his eyes carried the weight of disappointment and disillusion. "Sarah," he muttered finally, breaking the suffocating silence, "you told me your dad had nothing. You swore up and down he was broke. Now I find out he's sitting on millions, and you have no way of touching it?" She lifted her head, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I thought he was just a useless old man with nothing left. I thought he'd at least give me something when I asked. I never thought he'd hide all that from me." Daniel sighed, running his hands through his hair in frustration, or maybe he just saw right through you, through us. You mocked him, Sarah. You treated him like garbage. Why would he ever trust us with that kind of money? The words stung more than she cared to admit. Her sobs turned into angry cries. So what? I'm his daughter. That money should have been mine. It's my right. But even as she said the words, they felt hollow, like a script she was reciting to convince herself of a reality that no longer existed. She saw the way Daniel shook his head, his patience thinning with every word. "Your dad isn't giving us a cent," he said flatly. "And without that, we're stuck with the mess we've made, the debt, the lifestyle. We can't keep this up." Her chest tightened as panic clawed at her. She reached for him, desperation dripping from her voice. "Daniel, please, don't say that. We can figure this out together. We'll find another way. I need you." But Daniel stepped back, his expression cold. "I didn't marry you to live in struggle, Sarah. I thought you had connections, that your family would back us. I didn't sign up for this." The finality in his tone broke something inside her. For the first time, Sarah realized it wasn't just about the money, it was about the life she had tried to build on greed and appearances. And now, with the truth out, everything was crumbling. She collapsed back onto the couch, the sobs returning, louder this time. Her mind replayed her father's words, "Not 1 cent." She had mocked him, belittled him, ignored him unless she needed something. And now, because of her own arrogance, she had lost not just the inheritance, but the respect of her father and the loyalty of her husband. For Sarah, the crushing realization was unavoidable. Her greed hadn't just cost her money, it had cost her everything. The morning sun spilled through the curtains of my modest home, warm and golden, wrapping me in a light that felt different. For the first time in years, I woke without a weight pressing against my chest. No more sleepless nights wondering what Sarah would demand next. No more gnawing fear that my wife's gift, her carefully guarded legacy, would be squandered on greed. The burden had lifted. I sat at the small wooden table by the window, the same table my wife and I had shared countless breakfasts at. Her laughter still lingered in my memory, a gentle echo reminding me of everything she stood for: kindness, wisdom, and foresight. She had known this day would come. She had known our daughter's heart better than I ever dared to admit, and she had trusted me to carry the torch, to protect not just money but meaning. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. It was simple, yet it tasted better than anything I'd had in years. Freedom has a flavor, I thought, the flavor of peace. My mind drifted back to the night before the confrontation, the tears, the accusations. I had stood my ground, not with anger, but with quiet strength. My wife would have been proud. Sarah had wanted me to bend, to hand her the key to a life she believed she was owed. But I had chosen to honor the woman who had stood by me, the woman who had sacrificed, the woman who had seen further than both of us. The inheritance was secure now. Trusts had been established. Charities were set in motion. Scholarships would soon carry my wife's name, allowing bright young minds to chase dreams they could not have afforded otherwise. Every dollar would carry purpose, every act of generosity echoing her love for the world. It was more than money, it was immortality for her kindness. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. For the first time since she passed, I felt her presence not as a hollow absence, but as a living force guiding me. I had fulfilled my promise to her. I had protected her vision. There would be no more begging knocks at my door, no more hollow conversations dressed in manipulation. Sarah had made her choice. She had chosen appearances over love, greed over gratitude. I could not change her heart, but I could choose not to let her destroy mine. I stood, stretching slowly, my joints reminding me of my years, but my spirit lighter than it had ever been. Outside, the garden my wife had planted bloomed vibrantly, roses and lilies swaying in the morning breeze. I walked among them, brushing my fingers against the petals, each one a symbol of renewal. I whispered softly, almost to myself, almost to her. "It's done. You can rest now, and so can I." For the first time in decades, I felt whole. My dignity remained unbroken. My wife's legacy was untouchable. My life, though quieter now, was finally, blessedly, my own. This was liberation. The seasons turned, and with them, so did the course of our lives. News of Sarah's struggles reached me through neighbors and distant relatives. Her husband had left her not long after realizing there would be no fortune, no golden well to dip his hands into. Debt collectors circled her like vultures, and the glamorous image she had worked so hard to project crumbled under the weight of reality. The daughter who once mocked me for being cheap and ordinary now found herself alone, stripped of pride, clutching at the remnants of a life built on appearances. I did not gloat. I felt no joy in her downfall. Instead, I carried a quiet sorrow that she had chosen this path, sorrow that she could not see the richness of a simple, honest life. My late wife had been right. Our daughter's character was flawed, and no inheritance could have saved her from herself. Love cannot flourish where entitlement takes root, and wealth cannot heal a heart that refuses gratitude. Yet, even as Sarah wallowed in regret, I found my world expanding, not shrinking. The legacy my wife entrusted to me had blossomed into something greater than either of us could have imagined. The trust fund supported schools in struggling neighborhoods. Scholarships bore her name, lifting young men and women out of poverty and into possibility. A small hospital wing, painted in bright colors, now carried her memory with dignity. Each time I visited those places, I saw faces lit with hope. I heard laughter that had been silenced by hardship. I shook the hands of parents who thanked me with tears in their eyes, though they never knew the full story of how the funds had come to be. In those moments, I realized my wife's gift had transcended money. It had become a force for good, a wave of kindness rippling through lives far beyond our own. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside had dimmed, I would sit by the garden and feel her presence. The roses she once tended grew thick and strong, their fragrance carrying reminders of her gentle wisdom. I whispered my gratitude to her spirit, knowing she had guided me even in absence. I thought often of Sarah, of the daughter I still loved despite her betrayal. She lived in regret now, abandoned and burdened by choices she had made. Perhaps someday she would understand the lesson her mother left behind, that wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in character, kindness, and the lives we touch. Until then, I carried no anger toward her, only a quiet prayer that she would one day see the truth. As for me, I finally found peace. Not the fleeting peace of silence or solitude, but the deep, steady peace that comes from honoring a promise, from knowing I had done right by the woman who trusted me. My dignity was intact, my spirit unburdened, and my life, though modest, was richer than ever. I had lost a wife, and in many ways I had lost a daughter. But I had gained something greater purpose, and with purpose comes fulfillment. That is the legacy we leave behind. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.